So we're going to move on now to Arno Nordier. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Arno. He is originally from Harare and Pretoria, and he developed a passion for snakes very early on, catching his first venomous snake at the age of 14, giving educational talks by the age of 15. He's the chairman of the Transvaal Herpetological Association, or he has been for 7 years. And he pioneered South Africa's first courses on snake identification, snake bite treatment, and reptile handling. With more than 30 years of experience, he has assisted in over 250 snake bite cases, advises veterinarians, and trains medical professionals. An honorary lecturer at the University of Pretoria, he teaches snake bite treatment and co-hosts venomous animal workshops. He also breeds unique reptiles and collaboration with the government on reptile and collaborates with the government on reptile legislation. He's going to share with us all we need to know about snakes for handling, to breeding, and treating them. Arno, I'm absolutely fascinated by your biography. It sounds like you've done so much for South Africa, and I mean, treating over 250 snake bite cases is absolutely mammoth. So yeah, we absolutely honored to have you on our screen today. Thank you. You can go ahead.
Thanks very much. To all the Malawi people, Mulibwanje, I hope you enjoy it. I will have a live session after this, but for the first part, it's just a PowerPoint presentation. It is a mixture of what I could think of that you would probably need in Malawi. It's not meant for America, but it is meant for Africa and for treating African snakes. Okay, so in the next hour, you're going to be stuck with me. I'm going to cover reptile husbandry, which includes reptile physiology, common species of Malawi, reptile caging, related infrastructure, reptile keeping and feeding, diseases and reptile health, and sexual determination and breeding. Some of it has been already addressed by the two ladies before me, but I'll add to that as well if there is anything else that I feel could have been discussed, which would probably be more applicable to Malawi. Now, the most important thing when working with reptiles, especially in a place like Malawi, is get to know your reptile. It has a common name. In this case, we're looking at something called Muswema. I don't know it under that name. I know it under the name of olive sand snake, which is a fairly harmless snake. It's got venom, but it's not lethal. And then, obviously, the scientific name is Pseumophis mozambicus. The reason why you need to learn the scientific name of the snakes in your area is if you want to Google it and you're trying to Google a snake, for example, a garter snake, and it has just bitten someone. In Malawi, you do get garter snakes. They're not lethal, but it's a fairly serious bite, especially on a small child. Or when someone comes to you and says, look, can you help? What is this snake? When you Google garter snake, you're going to come across a snake in America which is harmless. It eats worms and fish and can be considered a pet. Because both of them are called garter snakes, you need to know the scientific name. So when you are going to Google something, you can Google the scientific name, and that one is generally going to give you a better result. Then if you look at snake physiology, snakes have all the organs that people have, excluding an appendix. So where we've got things like pituitary glands, heart, liver, gallbladder, pancreas, testes, adrenal glands, kidneys, sperm ducts, all of that snakes have as well. So they're not just this thing which has got a head and a tail and just a stomach in between. They've got everything else that we've got. And as a result, all of those things can go wrong with that snake during its life. Because snakes have only been in the pet trade, let's call it that, for the past, let's say, 40 years, we don't know as much about reptiles as what we do about dogs and cats and these sort of things. Plus, dogs and cats, some of them people really love them and will spend exorbitant amounts on them. Usually with snakes, by the time a snake gets sick, it's already too late to try and treat him. Snakes take a long time to show that they're ill. For example, the snake could get hurt tonight or get cold tonight, And in a month's time, he starts showing signs of sneezing, phlegm buildup in the lung. They only have one proper lung. The pythons and boas have two lungs, but all other snakes basically only have one lung. And the fact that they don't have a diaphragm makes it very difficult for them to expel any phlegm that is in the lung. So they can try hissing, and occasionally a little bit will come out. But the next problem that they have is in the bottom of their mouth, they've got a tiny opening called a glottis. That is what they breathe through, and it's movable. So when they're swallowing big food, they can still breathe, even if it takes them half an hour to swallow, and their mouth is technically full at the time. Now, for that snake to expel any phlegm, or in some cases even worms, out of that glottis is very difficult because of a very narrow opening. And as a result, when phlegm gets into the lung, it does cause problems, and more often than not, it does cause death. The other big problem that you have is the bottom third of the lung is not vasculated. This is basically just an air sac which moves up and down because they don't have a diaphragm to suck air into the lung itself. And if phlegm gets into that area, no antibiotic in the world is going to help that snake, because the antibiotic goes through the bloodstream, and the blood never gets to the bottom part of the lung. So respiratory infections are probably the biggest killer that we have in snakes, and probably in most reptiles as well. The other things like the liver, that can also become a problem if a snake is overfed. It starts to get what we call fatty liver. It looks like a salami. If you cut the liver open on autopsy, you'll see that there's little dots of fat in there, and that is because the snake has been overfed. Now, I don't know if there are that many pet snakes in Malawi, but this does become a problem if somebody is used to feeding a dog or a cat every day. They feed the snake every day. The snake will probably eat it until it gets so fat that it actually just dies of fatty liver disease. One of the dangers that you need to be aware of is if somebody brings you a snake which is dead, unless that snake is smelling, it is probably not considered dead. In this case, a small juvenile pit viper, a very dangerous one called Bothrops atrox, also known as a fer-de-lance, was chopped up by a person into 3 pieces, was brought to a facility, and the person picked up the head, and the snake turned around and bit him, and he ended up being envenomated. Why snakes can do this compared to other animals is if you chop the head, and especially if you still add a portion of the body, that head takes a long time to actually die. The brain is modified to survive over winter with very little oxygen. And because it's not got this oxygen supply, it doesn't mean that the brain is going to die. So even if you chop the head off, you'll sometimes see the head still moves, the eyes, the pupils will still dilate. And as a result, if it's venomous and you pick it up, it could bite you and you could die. So treat it as if it is alive until you're 100% sure. So in a case like that, you would be using a tube, which I'll show you later how to do that, or you'd be pinning the snake, which means that you will isolate the head and then be able to check if there's anything else. Most of the time, you don't need to handle it. If you do, use forceps and pick it up with that and observe it with that, and then put it back where you wanted it to go. Now, the more common species in Malawi, I'm going to run through them quickly. There is a book written by Tim Brammer. He's a herpetologist that was living funny enough, in Lilongwe as well. And he wrote a book. It's in English, and apparently there's one in the local vernacular. I think it's the Chewa. And it's a very good book, and he's got very nice photos of most of the snakes that occur in Malawi. So this is the most common snake you're going to come across. People bring it to you and say, what was this? It bit my dog. Or what was this? It's been injured. Can you help it? And that's a common brown house snake. Very easy to identify. Got 2 white stripes on its head, brown body on top, and a mother of pearl belly. Another snake that you get there quite often, these can grow quite large, up to maybe 1.5 meters, is a mole snake. As babies, they have all these patterns on them, but as adults, they're completely unicolor. They do have a very small bullet-type head, but a very strong body. So if they bite, quite often when they tear loose, they can leave a fairly gaping wound. So it's not something that you really want to mess around with. This is a snake which unfortunately gets killed far more often than what it needs to, and that's a common file snake. It looks like a three-cornered file. The scales are quite prominent and quite far apart, unusual for any snake to have that. And it's got this beautiful white stripe running all the way down its back. Now, this snake is harmless in that it doesn't have any venom, but these snakes will kill and eat any other snake. And people say, oh, but a mamba will kill it. No, a mamba will not kill it. If they get hold of it first, they constrict it, get it to a point where it's completely not able to move, and they'll just start swallowing it. So they eat mambas, they'll eat cobras, they'll eat puff adders, they love eating night adders. So it's a very useful snake. If you're scared of snakes and you want one snake around your house, this is the snake that you want to have. Another thing that you find there quite often is a common egg eater. These are smallish little snakes. The males only grow to about maybe 50 centimeters. Females can grow up to a meter. And these have got a very unique way of showing their displeasure. They turn into a horseshoe shape. They scrape their scales together and they'll lunge at you with this gaping black mouth. And it does look very scary and it does make a hissing noise, but they are completely harmless. They have no teeth no teeth that you could observe or that you could feel. So they're completely harmless. However, they do look very similar to a night adder. Now, if you compare the night adder at the top and the egg eater at the bottom, there are so many things that look similar that you would think it's very easy to misidentify them. But once you've seen a night adder and once you've seen an egg eater, you'll understand that they look completely different. Egg eater of a meter is probably as thick as your pinky finger, where a night adder of half a meter is probably as thick as a broomstick. And just by looking at that and the shape of the head, you can see, well, which one is venomous and which one isn't. The night adder won't kill you, but it's going to give you a couple of really unfortunate days. Then another snake, which is very common there, is a spotted bush snake. There are a few green snakes in Malawi, but the most common one that you're going to find there is a spotted bush snake. Any snake that's under a meter that's green is probably not venomous. Any snake over a meter that's green is more than likely going to be a boomslang. Spotted bush snakes average around a meter, but then also very thick, very thin, about as thick as a pencil, where a boomslang of a meter will probably be about as thick as a decent Vienna. If you look at this back-fanged snakes, these are snakes which have fangs more or less in the middle of the head. They're not right at the back. They can be quite big. In this case, there's a boomslang skull. You can see there are 3 fangs on either side, but they do not have the same system of delivering venom as what you see with something like puff adders or cobras. So their venom basically trickles into a hole that they make in you when they bite. Sorry, the fangs themselves are not hollow. They look like a broomstick with a crack in it. So the venom dribbles down this crack and into the wound, and that then envenomates the prey, or in some cases a victim as well, in the case of a human. So they don't inject venom that quickly, and if you pull them off quickly enough, then it's not really going to be much of a problem. The fangs do move a bit. I've actually seen an X-ray of the fangs, and as the snake bites, though, because the skull's bones are free floating, they're not connected and solid like a human or a dog, so those fangs can actually move forward, and they can strike a bit deeper than what you would expect. One of the common snakes that you'll find there with back fangs, although it's basically harmless, is something like the striped scarpsteker. There are no striped snakes in Malawi that can be considered dangerous except baby boomslang. And a baby boomslang will have a very broad stripe running down its back. More often than not, the stripe is broken up, but if they've got these solid stripes, especially if they've got more than 3 stripes on them, it means that they're harmless. This snake in Malawi is called a black-templed cat snake. We know it in South Africa as a red-lip snake or a herald snake. And the reason for that is in South Africa, they have they've got orange or red lips. However, in Malawi, they seem to have just like a pale white colored lip. But you can see there on the temples, they'll always be dark. They also flatten their heads. to supposedly look something similar to a cobra. However, these snakes are generally considered to be harmless. However, multiple bites from the same species is the same as being stung by bees over and over. Eventually, it is possible for your body to build up a sensitivity, and then you can have a bad reaction to it. This is one of the more common snakes which come out at night in Malawi, eastern tiger snake. It is primarily a gecko and lizard feeder. It'll also occasionally take sleeping chameleons or small tree frogs. So it comes out at night, and it's quite an active hunter. Closely related to the black-templed cat snake. It will also rear up, flatten its head, and do a few mock strikes before it actually bites. But a bite from them is generally considered not to be of any significance. However, when they get hold of you, they quite often will start chewing, and I don't like getting bitten by anything, so I just treat these snakes as if they are going to bite me, and obviously hold the head and the neck if I have to deal with them. Now we're getting on to one of the more dangerous snakes. This is a vine snake, also known as a twig snake and a bird snake, and they look like a piece of vine or a piece of twig. They live in trees, and if you come across them, they will freeze in position, hoping that their camouflage will help them blend into the environment. But if you bother them, they will puff up their throat. It looks like they swallowed a light bulb, and they will lunge at you a few times. If they do bite you, unfortunately, they do have a very strong hemotoxic venom. So what the venom does is it actually uses up your clotting factor, and you get what's called a DIC, or actually a VIC, a venom-induced consumption coagulopathy, which means that your blood then starts to pour out of your eyes, your nose, your mouth, and any other orifices that you have. So it's not a pleasant way to die. There are very few people that die from vine snakes. In Central Africa, we do have a couple of the larger ones which have killed people, but most of the time they're not considered lethal, but still not something that you want to go through. This one, however, is known for killing people very often. It is a boomslang. They have their venom causes exactly the same effects as what the vine snakes does, except that a boomslang's venom is different, and the antivenom for boomslang doesn't really work on vine snakes. If you wanted to use it on a vine snake bite, you'd need to use 40 vials, and 40 vials at the moment will cost you about $40,000, which is just a ridiculous amount to pay for that. So you would treat the one patient with, you treat the symptoms as they pop up, where in the case of a boomslang, especially if they bite dogs, a single vial of antivenom is more than enough to reverse the effect of the venom, especially if you get it in very quickly. There's a nice big green boomslang. These are generally males. With boomslang, most of the time, the green ones will be males and the brown ones will be females, but we have caught some green boomslang which have laid eggs. So obviously, the color doesn't ring true all the time. This is what your hand would look like after a boomslang bite. You can see there the blood is very, very watery, and it doesn't even really look like blood by the time it seeps out of the wound. So this blood was seeping out of the small bite mark that was on the knuckle, and unfortunately this patient took too long to get to the hospital, and he succumbed before they could get antivenom to him. A nasty little snake that you also find there is called a stiletto snake. The reason why they call it a stiletto is if you look at those fangs, they're actually hinged that move outwards and inwards. So when the snake gets upset, it actually extends one of the fangs left or right, and it turns and whips its head around, and it stabs you from the side. So that's where the stabbing and the stiletto part comes from. It doesn't open its mouth and physically bite you that way. It just stabs a fang into you. More often than not, it'll only be the one fang, but this is the one snake that you cannot pick up without getting bitten. There you can see what happens if you pick it up. It protrudes one of those fangs, and the fang actually extends past the first neck vertebrae. So it just turns its head, and it will puncture you. So any small black snake, please do not pick it up. If it is a stiletto snake, you cannot pick it up without getting bitten or having the possibility of being bitten. There's a lot of other small black snakes. There's Cape wolf snakes, there's purple gloss snakes, all other snakes which look fairly similar. However, it's better not to take a chance and just treat all of them as dangerous until you find out that it is one of the other species. When we get to the hinged front fangs, this is a skull of a puff adder. And if you look at it, on either side, it's got 3 or 4 loose fangs that are in reserve for if the fang in front breaks off. So if the fang breaks off, the next fang will move into position, and that can take anything, depending on temperature and the health of the animal, can take anything from 24 hours to a week, and then it will have a fully functional fang, which is in line with the venom duct, and as a result, it will still be venomous. So if somebody says, oh, they pulled the fangs out of the snake's mouth, good luck to them. In a week's time, when that snake bites them, they're going to die. So be aware of the fact that because a snake has lost a fang, it's not unusual, and it's the way life has given them that extra little bit of help, in that the fangs will always stay needle sharp. The fang is basically a hypodermic needle, although if you photograph it next to a hypodermic needle, in fact, it is sharper than a hypodermic needle. So you know how easily it can penetrate clothing, thin leather, that sort of stuff. And if you look at the length of those fangs, those are probably close to 1.5 centimeters. So even wearing leather gloves will not protect you from these fangs. People say, yes, but I've got leather gloves. And I go, but a puff adder can bite a cow. What was your glove made from? So that leather is not protection enough. This little snake's a beauty that you also find in Malawi, called a gaboon adder. It is known to have the longest fangs of any venomous snake in the world. The biggest one ever found had fangs that were 5 centimeters long. And you can imagine at 5 centimeters long, it goes right through anything. And I always joke, if it bites me in the hand, it'll go right through and inject the venom on the other side. But they do have a very, very potent cytotoxic venom and a decent percentage of hemotoxin as well. And this is the only snake that we have in Southern Africa, which also seems to have a cardiotoxin, as in we've had quite a few people have heart attacks after being bitten. Now, whether that was as a result of the blood that was clotting and actually blocked one of the arteries, or whether it was actually direct cardiac activity, we're not 100% sure, but it's not a bite that you want to mess around with. This is a puff adder. It's probably very close to the most common venomous snake or lethally venomous snake you'll find in Malawi. Very easy to identify. It's got a whole bunch of chevrons down its back pointing towards its tail, usually has a bar between the eyes. So you can see that striping there. It usually hisses a lot when you see it, and if you bother it, then it'll try to lunge at you. If it does bite you, then it injects venom extremely quickly. It is one of those snakes that when the fangs penetrate, the mucous membrane covering it is almost where the trigger comes from, and then it injects a large amount of venom. A decent bite from a puff adder will start causing swelling within a couple of minutes. The swelling will then get that much worse. Most of the time, deaths from puff adder venom are as a result of either blood clots, which can cause problems being lodged either in the brain or in the heart, as well as secondary infection caused by the massive necrosis. The venom from the snake causes huge black areas, which eventually rot, and then quite often secondary infection kicks in, and that usually causes systemic breakdown. So if you get to a doctor quick enough, or if a patient is brought in, for example, with a dog, if the dog has just started swelling and you know it's a puff adder, you can start giving antivenom, and the antivenom works very efficiently. Now we get onto the fixed front fangs. These are, in this case, this is a black mamba. You can see the fangs are not massive, although they are quite big, and they're right in the front of the mouth. And like I said, they can move. They're connected to that little bone you can see there. So when they strike, they open their mouth, they actually extend the fangs till right the tip of the mouth, and they'll have more of a stabbing action, where the cobras have a chewing action as well. Either way, they still inject enough venom to potentially cause a death. There's a black mamba. It is quite common in rural areas. It is not black, it is gray. Most of the time, the inside of the mouth is black. However, recently I've seen a couple of photos where the inside of the mouth has been white, and in another case it was pink. So don't go on that every time as an identification. It is quite easy to identify the snake if you have it in this sort of situation where you can see it always looks like it's got a smile on its face. And if you look at it from above, the head will be in the same shape as a coffin. And there's a very good reason why it's got a coffin-shaped head. This is one of the snakes which causes the most bites in Malawi, called the Mozambique spitting cobra. It is really a nasty little snake. Brownish color on top. Underneath, it's like a salmon pinkish color, can sometimes be orange, and then it's got the black banding under the neck. It is one of those snakes which is very difficult to pin down. As babies, they move around during the day, the reason being that the adults will eat them. The adults come out at night when there's more prey running around, like mice and rats and frogs, which is also part of their diet. However, these snakes will eat anything that fits in their mouth. If it's an egg, another snake, a baby tortoise, whatever, they will eat it. They can climb, they can swim, they spit very well, they spray venom up to a distance of about 2 meters. If it gets you in the eyes, burns like crazy. And because of the burning sensation, quite often people rub their eyes and then they just rub the venom further into the eye. The venom then causes corneal abrasions, and once the cornea has those holes in them, quite often you get secondary infection. So a decent ophthalmic antibiotic is usually recommended for this as well. When they bite, of all the cobras, they're the ones that have the most cytotoxic venom. So it causes massive swelling very quickly, causes necrosis. And in this case, if you don't get antivenom in within probably between half an hour and an hour, the chances of necrosis are over 90%. So it does cause massive necrosis, and it is a nasty little snake to work with. So if somebody does bring you one of those, treat them with respect, wear glasses at all times. And if the venom lands on your skin, you can just wash it off. It's not a problem, unless you have a cut, in which case it'll go in there and it'll be an irritant. It's not going to be as bad as having been bitten. So it's not a terrible thing to have venom on your skin, but some people do become sensitive to this venom, especially if they have breathed it in over and over and over. Eventually they become so sensitive that they can't even go into a room where there's a Mozambique spitter. Then you get black-necked spitting cobras, also fairly common, and they have a very similar venom to the Mozambique spitting cobra. But the nice thing is, if in Malawi, originally you using antivenom that was made in South Africa called SAVP antivenom, which is a polyvalent. You're now mainly getting stuff from India called Panaf, which is very effective on the black-necked spitting cobra as well. And then there's another one called ICP, which comes from Costa Rica, which is a lot cheaper. And the dosages also seem to be lower than what we need for the others. And that works very well on animals. We've used it on animals in South Africa a number of times, and it's worked very well, even for mambas. And they also use it in Eswatini, the old Swaziland. They use it there quite a lot, and it does work. So if you're going to buy antivenom, contact someone who has experience with antivenoms so that they can tell you which ones work and which ones don't. There are some other antivenoms that do pop up on the market every now and then, more especially from India. But because they're cheap, people buy them, not looking at what species they cover. Because antivenom is very species specific, it doesn't help you get one which is meant for the Philippine cobras and the Indian cobras and Russell's vipers and things which don't occur in Malawi. So make sure that the antivenom that you get actually covers the venomous snakes of Malawi. Sorry, throat getting dry. Right, so typical reptile caging. If you're going to be holding a reptile for any extended period of time, it is best to use a cage, something like this. This is what we generally known as a terrarium. In this case, it's got a carpeting base at the bottom, but you can use newspaper. If it's a quarantine type cage, newspaper is definitely recommended. The inside of that wood is not raw. It's been painted with a yacht sealer, so that makes it almost waterproof. And as a result, if there are any diseases and things, when you take a snake out, you can disinfect the entire cage without it soaking into the wood. The snake is there. It's got a little hide box that it can climb into. So if it's feeling stressed or it's trying to digest its food, it can go into the hide box. Plus, the hide box is big enough that it can sit on top of it if it wants to, if it's digesting food and just wants to be out of the way. There's a shelf there as well. Every time you put in a shelf, you're actually extending the amount of floor space, because now there are 2 floors. So the snake can climb a bit more and can lie on at different heights in the cage, which will longer snake as well. These cages all have heating pads in the bottom. Heating pads are generally what we stole from the fridge industry. But if you buy one which is about 14 watts and you connect it to a thermostat, it works very well. It doesn't get too hot, doesn't get too cold. So you're going to probably be keeping the snake around about 25 to 28 degrees, and that's more than enough what the snake needs. In this case, there is carpeting in the bottom. These are 2 sets of carpet. So the one set is in there, and the other set has been taken out. It's been cleaned with F10 and then hung in the sun to dry. The reason why we hang it in the sun is basically the same reason why a vulture sits with its wings open. The UVB then kills any bacteria that are there. If you're using a cage for something like a lizard, you would have a spotlight, because the lizards need to bask in some sort of light. And so you'd have the spotlight there. You'd have climbing branches, especially for geckos or chameleons, that they can climb up. The light is away from anywhere where the lizard can climb onto it, and it's easy to just open and close the front. The entire lid is open, so not open, it's got mesh on it. So you do have a very good circulation of air, which is always healthy for them. In some cases, we use what we call a rack system or a tub system. These are basically just 11-liter tubs, which you've got a snake in there. It's got a paper substrate, it's got a water bowl, possibly a small hide box, and this is what we use for quarantining snakes and for raising baby snakes. If you house snakes, please do not house them together. In this case, there were 2 house snakes, which are not known to be cannibalistic at all. They were kept in the same cage, and they were fed. They were put back into the cage, and the one decided the first movement he saw must be some more food, so he grabbed his cage mate, constricted him, and ate him. He also regurgitated it and died shortly after that. So obviously, when he constricted, they were constricting each other, and he did pick up some damage. But this happens a lot. You cannot put 2 snakes in the same cage and expect them to coexist happily. It generally doesn't happen, and I see heartache like this far too often. So in a veterinary situation, you should really not have 2 snakes in the same cage, because the one could have a disease that the other one doesn't have, and they'll just contaminate each other. And also, if there's a shedding and there's 2 snakes in the cage, you don't know which one it was that shed. If there was a snake that regurgitated, which one was it? Which one needs treatment? If you find worms in the feces, which one do you treat? Which one do you not? So it's better just keep each snake in its own cage. Now, these are sort of things that you will probably require if you're going to be keeping snakes for any period of time, even just while they're getting medical attention. So we're looking for lizards. We've got calcium. We've got globes there, which give off UVB. You're obviously going to need forceps. There's carbodust, which we use to dust the bottom of caging on snakes, not on lizards, which kills things like external parasites like mites and ticks. And then you've got a hand sterilizing spray, which you should use whenever you work with them. These are also tools that you might need. The ones at the top are just basically known as snake tongs. You can get quite long ones, you can get shorter ones. Then underneath that, there's what we call a pinning stick, which you use to hold the snake in one position without injuring it. It has a piece of rubber at the bottom, and that will make sure that the amount of pressure that's being placed on the snake doesn't cause any further harm, and then a normal hook stick. I'll show you some of this just now when we get to the live part as well. Then feeding, same as the people in Bloemfontein, we also use frozen rodents. It is just far more humane. It's a lot easier. I don't want to keep 20 cages of rats and mice and then make sure they've been fed and cleaned and they are healthy, and it's just too much effort. I'd rather just buy them frozen. I put them in the freezer, I take out what I need, I defrost them, and I put them in for the snake to eat. If it's a wild snake that's just come in, what we normally do is we defrost the food overnight, take it from the freezer, put it in the fridge, and then at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon or just before you knock off, you spray the cage lightly, simulating some rainfall, and then you warm the mouse up using a hairdryer or something similar. Don't go put it in the microwave, they explode. And you just pop that in the cage, close the cage, and walk away. Snakes do not eat easily when there are people around or if there's any movement. So give the snake its privacy, and more often than not, the wild snakes will also eat dead food. I have numerous wild snakes which I use for training, and I don't feed any of my snakes live food. And people say, oh, but my snake doesn't want to eat live food. Yeah, I've got over 300 snakes that all eat dead food. Obviously, what you're doing is your husbandry is wrong. When you've got things like lizards and that which you need to feed, these are mealworms. It's a small beetle which then lays tiny little eggs which hatch into these worms, actually larvae, and then they turn into pupa, and then they turn into beetles again. This is a very easy source of food. It can be used for birds, can be used for monkeys, can be used for quite a few insectivorous animals, and they're very easy to keep. You just buy some bran, you get a few beetles, put them in there, and once a week you can give them a few slices of orange or apple or something just so that they can get some moisture from that. Don't make it too wet, because once it starts rotting, they die off as well, and they will just keep reproducing, and you harvest the larvae or the beetles as and when you need. But do not turn the culture over every time. Just scratch it on the surface, because every time you turn it over, you're moving the eggs from a specific depth where the parents laid that, so that that's the right temperature for them to hatch. And by turning it over so often, you reduce the number of babies that you're going to have. If you're working with tortoises, all the land tortoises that we have eat various types of vegetation. Some of them will also eat a small amount of calcium in the form of cooked bones. But most of the time, if you give them a decent diet of fresh vegetables and a lot of leafy stuff, they love things like hibiscus flowers. They like mulberry leaves. Kikuyu grass is very good for them, as is lucerne. It's got a very high calcium content, and most of the time your tortoises will be happy with that. If you're looking at your terrapins, terrapins do not eat vegetation, they eat meat. So they will take something like a small mouse, or you could even take strips of meat and put that in there. Most of the time, they're quite voracious feeders. The problem is that if they grab meat, they'll often tear it into pieces using their front legs, which have claws on them. So they'll tear that off, and there'll be little bits floating in the water. That then becomes rancid. So you've got to have a very good filtration system, or replace the water very regularly. And you don't want to use water straight from a tap. So it does become a bit of a procedure. However, they're very easy to get to feed. And then whatever you've had to do with them, whether it be fixing a shell or waiting for a wound to heal, they can then be released after that. One of the diseases you get in snakes is mites. This is an external parasite. As you can see there with the arrows pointing, it's a tiny little thing. It's smaller than the dot on a page where somebody typed a full stop. They are really, really small. That's as adults. They're even smaller as babies. They will be on a snake in hundreds of thousands. They will actually drink all the blood out of a snake, leave it anemic, and the snake will die. And if you don't look carefully, you don't see these mites. So if you handle a snake and you put it down, look on your hands. If you see tiny little dots, like little bits of pepper moving on your hand, you know for sure that snake's got mites. If you can see one mite, multiply that by at least 100 to know how many mites are in that area. These mites then climb off the snake, they lay eggs, and they die, and then the eggs hatch. It's basically like a glorified little tick. The eggs then hatch. They can take up to 3 months to hatch. These little babies then all climb on the snake, generally at night, not so much during the day. They will suck blood, they will then mate, and they will carry on with the whole cycle. So that's why if you're going to clean a cage where the snake has got mites, you, number one, wash the snake down. You can use a product like Fipronil Frontline. You can spray them with that or wipe them down with that. You cannot inject them with ivermectin because the amounts required to treat a snake is so small that you can't even draw it up in the smallest syringe that you have. So don't try that. You'd overdose them. If it's a big thing like a crocodile or a large monitor lizard, you can dilute it and try to use some ivermectin, but most of the time Fipronil works. And then you sterilize the cage. If you can take a hairdryer, put it on hot, put it in every corner that there is, heat that cage up to the point where all the eggs hatch and die immediately. It is one way to get rid of it, but mites will spread through a collection very fast. A mite can walk 60 meters per night. So if there's any place within 60 meters, within one night, that mite could have reached them. So just by putting the cages 1 meter or 2 meters apart, it's not going to isolate that snake from getting mites. Another thing that you find on reptiles are ticks. In this case, you can see that massive tick that's gone under the carapace of the tortoise there. Those are very big. The biggest ticks I've ever seen have been pulled off tortoises. With monitor lizards or leghorns, what we found is that ticks actually go and sit inside the nostrils, and to get them out of there, you're going to need to sit with tweezers and pull and pull and pull and try and get them all off. That's why in some cases we do use ivermectin, but the dosage is extremely small. You must not overdose on that. On snakes, we do sometimes find ticks. It's very rare to find ticks, and then when we do, that snake is covered in ticks. So I don't know if it's a specific species, but you do sometimes find that, and then you can treat the same. You can just pull them off with a tweezer, or like in this case, or you could actually just spray them with something like Frontline and hope that gets rid of all of the ticks. You cannot inject a tortoise with ivermectin. If you do, it will die. The leg will rot and it will fall off. Right, there's the Fipronil or Frontline that we use for most of the mites and ticks. It is quite expensive, but you can find generics of it, and as long as it's a product with Fipronil in it, then you're golden. Right, diseases in reptiles, we've got worms. This is obviously a tapeworm. When the snake defecates, you can actually just put it in water, float it, and have a look under a microscope, and you can see what sort of worms it's got. And then according to that, you can treat it with whether it be Flagyl, Panacur, whatever is the right medication for that. And then just make sure that you follow up like once every 4 days, once every 8 days, whatever you're going to do. If you need to inject antibiotics, do not inject it in the lower third of the reptile. The lower third of the circulatory system goes through the kidneys before it goes through the rest of the body. So you need to give it either intramuscularly or subcutaneously in the top third to half of the body, because then it gets to the entire snake. With the worms, there's also some roundworms. Also, just treat them, and obviously make sure that you wear gloves while you're working with this animal, because there's a good possibility it could cross over, and you could become infected. Right. So now, the sexual determination of snakes and lizards. In this case, it's quite easy to see the difference between these two geckos. The one has a very broad head. The other one's got a narrow head. Mostly the ones with the broad heads are the males. They do most of the calling, and they need to sometimes fight for their females, where the female has got a more slender head, and she doesn't really have to call that much or fight. On some of the lizards, it's quite easy. The tail, which is long and thin, will be the female, and the one that's short and fat will be the male. In some cases, you have a long fat tail as well, but if you compare the two, the one will be fatter than the other. In this case, the fat tail there has got hemipenes in it. There'll be two of them, one on either side, which the lizard then uses to mate with. Here's some. This is rhinoceros vipers, which occur very close to you guys in Uganda. And there you can see the difference between a male and a female. The female is on the left. She's got a very short tail. There's nothing inside the tail of significance, while the male has got two hemipenes secreted in the tail itself. And I'll show you just now how to determine sex by probing it. Now, when you look at a snake's hemipenes, these are the hemipenes of a mole snake. And you can see there they are bifurcated. They are very, very strange. Each species has unusual looking hemipenes. And in some cases, if you look at the hemipenes, that's the only way to tell the difference between, for example, two different types of cobras. They usually do not interbreed that easily. So you very rarely find hybrids. But under extreme stressful conditions, it is possible to find hybrids in similar species. But you won't, for example, have a cobra crossing with a mole snake, because there you can see what a mole snake's hemipenes look like. And that's what a puff adder's hemipenes look like. They're not very impressive. And there you can see what a cobra's hemipenes look like. So those hemipenes will not fit on a female of the wrong species. And as a result of that, you can see which ones are male and which ones are female. Then when we get down to breeding, with pythons, they will lay their eggs and they'll cuddle around them and they'll keep them warm. They'll shiver. They're the only snakes that have true maternal instinct in that they incubate the eggs. There are other snakes which will stay near the eggs, for example, the king cobras, scalpstekers. There are a couple that the female will stay near the eggs, but she's also just basically happens to be there. With king cobras, they'll defend the nest. They build a nest. They lay them in the nest, and they'll actually defend them, and they will attack you if you get too close to them. If somebody does bring you a python which is gravid, when she lays eggs, you must very carefully cover her head with a towel. Try to grab her without disrupting the eggs too much. Get her off the eggs, put her in a completely different cage. She mustn't even be able to smell the eggs, and you can take those eggs and incubate them yourself. The reason why we do that is because the female will start eating much quicker if she's not incubating the eggs. If she's incubating the eggs for up to 3 months, she won't eat. She'll rarely get off the eggs except to drink water, and they are really emaciated after that. So if the snake has already come into captivity due to injury, dogs, whatever, then you need to give her attention so that she can breed again, and at the same time you can incubate the eggs in an incubator. Do not rotate the eggs under any circumstances. Those eggs must stay in exactly the same position as what they were laid, and you just put them in an incubator between 28 and 30 degrees and just wait till you see the babies. Here we put the eggs in vermiculite, which is a product you can buy in the nursery. Mix it by weight, 1-to-1 with water. Put it down there, pack the eggs in there, and put that in the incubator. This is what happens when an animal does not have a chance to lay the eggs. When a chameleon lays its eggs, they're very, very small. They're about the size of a Tic Tac sweet. And then the eggs themselves actually grow to this size underground. But in this case, this poor animal was kept away from an area where she could lay eggs, and she retained the eggs inside her, and they started growing to the point where she could never pass them, and she actually died as a result of that. So if you get a chameleon in that does look bulky, give her at least 30 centimeters of soil to dig into. If you see she's digging, close her up and don't bother her for the next day. She'll then lay the eggs right at the bottom, and they will then hatch there. If you've got live-bearing snakes, for example, puff adders or gaboon adders or any of those snakes that do give live birth, this can also happen. Those are infertile ova that are there, as well as 1 or 2 stillborn babies. This is usually as a result of either the male not being fertile, or with the stillborn babies, the female was not warm enough to actually incubate the eggs that she kept inside her. So you do see this, and it's more stressful on the snake because a a baby is like a squishy jelly baby that can come out, where the eggs are actually quite hard, the infertile eggs, and they can also quite easily get stuck. If you're looking at hatching tortoises, what happens is the tortoise actually grows on top of the egg yolk, and as it grows bigger, it absorbs the egg yolk through the umbilical slit into the body. And these 3 tortoises were dug out of the ground too early, and you can see where their development was. What happens is quite often female tortoises will find one area which they like, and they'll lay eggs there, and another female will lay her eggs on top of them or next to them. And quite often when they start hatching, they trigger each other to hatch, and then you're going to end up with this problem. In that case, just keep them on wet paper towel and keep them very warm. The warmer it is, the quicker they develop, and the quicker they develop, the easier they're going to absorb the egg yolk. If you're lucky enough and you've put the eggs in an incubator, these eggs were kept in an incubator at 31 degrees because they're pythons. You'll see the little python cutting the egg open with its snout. It's got a little egg tooth there, and it opens it up, and the snake will climb out. Once it's shed, you can, if you want to, you can feed it. Otherwise, if you could just release it in a suitable area, that would be fine. And yeah, all right, that's me. That's as far as I'm going to go now. I'll do the live demo probably in about another couple of minutes. I think we've now got time for questions, if I'm not mistaken.
Thanks, Arno. Geez, I'm absolutely bowled over. It's absolutely fascinating. I've learned so much, and your images are amazing. So yeah, just wonderful, wonderful. Good. I'm glad you've got something to drink. I was just going to say, don't you want to get something to drink? Because it sounded like you were, I mean, you obviously working very hard there. So Arno, there's quite a few questions that have come in. Are you happy to answer a few?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. So now the first one was around anti-venom. Oh yeah, this is actually my question. I'm going to jump in quickly. Anti-venom. We had somebody speak on our Unlocking Nature program before on anti-venom and the whole process of making anti-venom. And since then, I've spoken to somebody who uses a bit more of a modern method of making anti-venom and injecting venom into snakes to create that anti-venom. Yeah, I just wanted to get your sense about that, whether it's something that you've heard.
Okay. It's not that they inject venom into the snakes. It's actually that they draw blood from snakes which are almost immune to venom. So I know the person who you're speaking of. I knew him before he even moved to America. He has had the product patented in America, and he is doing research on dogs in South Africa. He's approved for that. So what they do is they remove the blood from a large snake, for example, a python or something. The centrifuge take out all the antibodies and inject that into a victim like a dog. And because the snake has natural immunity, it then passes this over onto the dog. So far, the results have seemed very promising, but I'd like to see more before I try it on myself. But it does seem very promising. The big problem why there's such an urge for this is because SAVP have stopped producing antivenom due to just a total collapse of a government facility. And Chris was actually one of the guys who was supplying them with the raw venom to make the antivenom. And now our venom is being imported from India. It's called Panaf, and it's also imported from Costa Rica. That's the ICP. And both of them are very good antivenoms. And to be honest, we don't really need South Africa to make antivenom anymore because these companies are now moving at lightning speed to try and make up for all the other snakes which they didn't cover before because they never intended selling it in Southern Africa. So hopefully we can then supply India with our venom so that we can make antivenom, which is for the snakes that we have specifically in South Africa, because they never intended it for Cape Cobras. They never intended it for wrinkles because wrinkles and Cape Cobras don't occur anywhere except in Southern Africa. And Southern Africa was covered by South Africa. We would supply more than enough antivenom. So it was never They never needed to make it. Now they need to make it because now we started using it. So that's where the venom and antivenom comes in. But if you just look on the pamphlet before you buy it, there are quite a few good antivenoms. Panaf is the one, and ICP is the other one. And then when SAVP comes back in, that'll be worthwhile. We do have a slight problem with scorpions, the parabuthid scorpions. The only people that made antivenom was South Africa, and they've stopped making it, or they don't have anymore. And India is rushing like crazy to try and make some. But milking scorpions takes a long time, and you only get very small amounts. And for them to do that, test it, and get it into production, it's going to take a while. But Chris will be able to tell us more about if they actually do, if they are interested in buying antivenom from us, or venom from us. Sorry.
Yeah, I know. I like the way that you say that with a very straight face that you want a little bit more testing before you use it on yourself. I'm not planning to do that. Chris, do you want to come in? I see your cameras come on.
Just a quick comment. I mean, Arno's hit the nail on the head there perfectly. I mean, I think he summarized it beautifully. I hate to say it, but our South African government, SAVP, South African Vaccine Producers, has done South Africa a favor by their crash, basically, since COVID and non-supply. We were all running around extremely nervous. Like, how are we going to save people's lives? Like, how are we going to save limbs? How are we going to protect a 2-year-old little girl who's been bitten by a Mozambique spitting cobra on the hand? How are we going to save her fingers? You know what I mean? And it was a dire situation. And they basically forced us to hit the ground running and go find alternatives. And what we've done is we've found some absolutely amazing alternatives. And I really hope that SAVP, our South African producers, come to the party and beef up their product that they used to produce for our South African market, because they are really behind right now. And I really hope they can come back, but it's looking really good for these amazing new products that we see coming into the country. Yeah,
I know a couple of questions. I'm going to head into those. So Upendo Chula says, you mentioned that you can't keep snakes together, but he says, what if the snakes come from the same litter?
It doesn't matter. Brother and sister have no affinity to each other. Brother will eat his sister, mother will eat her babies. Even if they come from the same litter, it makes no difference whatsoever. It is best to keep each one on its own, because they just need to be triggered by something, a smell, a movement, and they grab their brother or sister and they will eat him. Snakes do not have the intelligence to not do that. Some of the lizards, however, do have a hierarchy. So you're looking at, there's a dominant male with a whole lot of females, and there'll be dominant males around the side. So with lizards, it's different, but they'll preferably be kept outside. But if it's just for a veterinary situation where you're going to keep them for a short period of time, you can also keep them each one singly in a cage.
Okay, good. Upendo also asked another question. Did you ever encounter a snake that has dehydration, and how do you treat it?
Dehydration in snakes is quite common. We see it quite often with snakes being brought in from the wild, especially if they've fallen down into an area where there isn't water and they've been left there to dry out, or they've climbed into some man-made structure and couldn't get out, and as a result have been there for 2 or 3 months. It does take quite a while to become dehydrated. What you do with the snake then is you take it and you put it in a very, very shallow warm water, so slightly warm, not warm for us, warm for snakes. So if you can check it with a temp gun or a thermometer, around about 28 degrees, about 1 centimeter deep. Put the snake in there. He mustn't swim. He must be able to lie there, and he must drink. And then when you pick him out, you pick up the head gently so the water doesn't pour out again, because they're going to drink far more than what they need. Then you put them back in the water. So as soon as the water's dirty, you clean it. If you want to, you can add some electrolyte solution to the water, but make it very, very dilute. You're diluting it to about what we would drink in electrolyte solution, for example, for children or even for sports drinks. You can take that and dilute it about 1 to 10 and add that to the water, because then they've got all the salt and potassium that also comes in, and as a result they'll drink it. So you leave the snake in that warm tub probably for about 2 or 3 days, then remove it, wait 2 days, put it back. It does take a while to get the snake completely hydrated again, but once it's feels it's ready, it'll shed its skin, which is something which snakes do when they feel better, or they've just gotten over a sickness. They'll shed their skin quite often, and often when they're sick, they'll shed their skin. Even if it's an internal parasite, they'll still shed their skin, because in their head they're thinking, okay, I must have ticks or mites or some external parasite. If I shed my skin, that's staying behind and I can move away. So if a snake sheds a lot, you need to be aware of that. But usually after dehydration, if the snake has shed once and the shedding is in a very good condition, not small little flakes, then the snake is ready for release.
Okay, sure. I know you're teaming with you have an abundance of knowledge. I'm very impressed. It's all very amazing experience. Okay, so are there tick-borne diseases in reptiles?
Not any that we are aware of. However, just basically because there hasn't been research done on that, but there is a very good chance that the diseases are carried. We know on the mites, they do carry diseases like inclusion body disease. So it's not a disease that's transmitted to humans at this stage, but I'm fairly sure that you would be able to get that. For example, the ticks on the tortoises carry heart water disease, and as a result, tortoises from Southern Africa are not allowed to enter the US because the ticks that are on them are taking heart water disease into America. Even though the tortoise doesn't show it, the ticks bite cattle and then climb onto the tortoises, so they can carry it all the way to America. The chances that it's going to spread there is almost zero, but just as a precaution, they don't allow it. So yes, there are some diseases that you would be able to find in ticks. However, from the tick getting off the reptile and then onto you is very slight. And obviously when you're working with them, you've got gloves on, and then afterwards you sterilize your hands.
Okay, I think pretty much the last question that we're going to ask is, how do you tell, this is from Mike Matale as well, how do you tell between venomous and non-venomous snakes just by appearance, or can you?
Nope. You can't, unfortunately. There are a few giveaways. If a snake rears up and makes a hood, there's a very good chance that it's venomous. But other than that, there's no hard and fast rule that we can say, okay, look, if it's green or brown or got a triangular head or a specifically shaped cloaca or specifically shaped pupil. There are all these stories on the internet, but they actually don't exist. So no, there's no quick and easy way. You've got to buy a book and then just practice. Every roadkill that you get of a snake, please pick it up, because then you can learn how to sex them. You can do autopsies, you can do all that sort of stuff. So by the time you get it live, you know what it is. But once again, be careful. Don't put your hand in its mouth. I've seen people trying to feel for fangs, and I'm going, you've got a latex glove on. Those things bite through leather, so that's not a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, I see you've got your hand raised.
Okay, I won't put my camera on. Can you hear me? I'll just talk.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, just a quick one on the dehydration. Sometimes what we also do is we do interperitoneal or just subcut boluses of any type of Ringer's lactate or saline liquid. So you force a bolus of liquid into the body cavity or just under the skin in different places of the body, and let that slow absorption also assist for dehydration cases like that, if they're really extreme. Yeah.
Okay, wow. That probably takes quite a lot of experience. It sounds like something that is a bit tricky.
It is, yeah. But I mean, for this platform today, I should imagine we have some really keen veterinary students. You know, you might win some, you might lose some, but it's a good thing to try.
Absolutely. Okay, and I just see that there's one more question that has popped up from Thomas Kipetu. Are snakes the only reptiles that are venomous?
No, there are some others, and I think hopefully Chris will be able to cover them. There are funny enough, monitor lizards do have venom glands. They just have a very, very bad venom delivery system. But for example, I've seen it I counted last night in 11 cases in South Africa where people have been bitten by rock monitors, and they actually have had a venomous effect on them, mainly muscle spasms, diarrhea, vomiting, insane headaches, and then contractures as well, where the person is if he's sitting and he tries to get up, he can't move out of that position. They only last about 24 hours. But then I've been bitten numerous times and I've never had any effects. But I've seen this too often with an exact timeline being identical between people. The one was a vet in Wellington. The other one was a very well-known snake catcher in Durban. There was a girl in Johannesburg. So it's from different places, and all of them gave me exactly the same experience. And Dr. Brian Fry, who's probably professor now, Professor Brian Fry is probably the world authority on toxicology. He actually did the research on that. He's presented he published about 3 different papers on the venom. And it started with a Komodo dragon where he was looking at, do they have like a filthy bacteria or do they have a venom? And it turns out they actually have a venom.
Okay. Arno, I'm going to keep you for 1 more minute. There was a question. Oh, okay, wait. We've got a very interesting one from Upendo Chulu. Is it true that onions repel snakes?
Nope. Nothing. There's basically nothing that repels snakes unless it's something which is going to also repel all humans. So whether it's onions, garlic, lavender, tea tree, all these things, none of them actually work because a snake doesn't smell through its nostrils. Even if it's sticking its tongue out and there is something which is offensive, it won't keep them away. If they're in a hurry, they don't have their tongues flickering in and out. So they'll cross anything, be it diesel or alcohol or whatever people have thrown on the ground. And so it won't make any difference. If there are more questions, we can catch up on them later because I still need to
I'm just thinking the same thing. Yeah. So I think
if you can give me 5 minutes.
Yes, we're going to take a 5-minute break. Bridget, just make sure that your students are back in 5 minutes. That would be amazing. And yeah, we'll see you in 5 minutes' time for a live demonstration by Arno. Thank you very, very much. Okay, Arno, let's see if I have got questions for you. Oh yeah, here we go. Have you ever encountered any cancerous cases in snakes, and how do you treat that?
Unfortunately, yes, we do have cancer, and we have found it in a number of species. Everything from cancerous growths to cancer of specific organs. It is unusual. It usually happens in very, very old snakes. And to date, I have not found any treatment that works. Even excising a growth or something like that, they usually just come back. It's one of the more difficult things to treat. So unfortunately, if a snake has cancer and it's been confirmed as cancer, then it's usually better just to euthanize the snake. Euthanasia is actually quite easy on a snake. What you do is you take some of the liquid barbiturate, you put it down the throat and give it a decent dose of that. That will eventually allow the snake to be turned onto its back. And then as you run your fingers down the body, you'll feel where the heart is beating. And then you can inject directly into the heart. If you're trying to do that without having pre-medicated it, the snake has a really horrible reaction because it's very painful. So you'd rather want to dope him first and then only inject directly into the heart. And then it takes a couple of seconds and then the snake is gone.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in the field, however, and you come across an injured reptile, the easiest is, like they say in the Bible, just crush the head. So as long as there's massive traumatic brain injury, that will immediately stop any pain or anything else to the snake. There will still be movement, even if you chop off the head. There will still be movement of the body for minutes after that. And if you cut it open, the heart will still be beating an hour later. So that is why chopping off the head is not a solution, because the brain still triggers and does feel pain and stressed. So by crushing the brain cavity completely, brain case and the brain itself, it's that much better for the animal.
Arno, the question that we were trying to ask you while you were in that little room that we were struggling to hear you, um, out of curiosity, it's from Master Phileas. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Out of curiosity, are those your snakes? And are they defanged? Is it necessary to defang a poisonous snake with the purpose of keeping it as a pet?
No, none of the snakes have been defanged or been milked or anything like that. They are as hot as the day they came from the bush. Most of them are problem snakes which have had to be removed. Um, and as a result, I keep them because I do training with them as well. On Monday, for example, I've got a lecture again for the, funny enough, fifth year medical doctors. And then I've got another course again next Friday. So I use them so that people can get up close and personal with them. And that's why we work with them. By defanging them, it means absolutely nothing. The fangs just grow back. There is a way to get rid of the venom in total. So what you do is you do a venom ductectomy where you actually remove the duct so that it can't meet up again and produce that, or you can remove the venom gland itself. But if you do that, it disfigures the snake and is illegal in most countries because it is a cosmetic procedure which is unnecessary. The snake isn't better off afterwards, so why do you do it? But there are idiots in Australia who do it. They just put the snake in the fridge, and while it's still alive, they rip the venom glands out. And we see it in America quite a bit. There are, even though those are done under veterinary conditions, the snake just never looks good. The head looks sunken. They've now tried putting silicone in to make up for the venom gland, but it's a horrible thing. And if you just respect them, there's no need to get bitten. Yes, mistakes happen, but plan for that, have antivenom, and you should be fine.
Yeah, Arno, you were going to say something?
Talking about the crocodiles earlier and the temperature that you have for incubation with crocodiles, they're closely related to birds, so that's why they have this very similar problem. And the eggs don't mind being messed around with. Where with snakes and lizards, with snakes, it is the gender is determined at conception. So you can take those eggs and incubate them at 28 degrees or 32 degrees. You're still going to have the same number of males and females. However, with some of the lizards, it also depends on at what temperature you incubate them, whether you're going to have more males or females, more especially the geckos. They do that quite a bit. And then tortoises also do the same. That's why they build a flask-type nest, and then they lay the eggs one on top of the other, so that there's different temperature gradients. But it's not that common in, well, it's not found in snakes at all. And if the snake is a live bearer or ovoviviparous, meaning or viviparous, sorry, where it actually keeps the eggs inside it and then basically gives birth to live babies, then in those cases, if there was this problem, then because the female has to move around to keep them at a certain temperature to basically incubate them inside her, you would have 1 year she would just have males and 1 year just have females, which is not what we want. We want a nice balance between males and females. What we do find in reptiles, which has also been recorded in sharks and in birds, is parthenogenesis, where a female who is without a male and would like to reproduce, she produces babies which are then all females. And those females can grow up and reproduce either asexually or mated with another male. However, they're not that strong. But Komodo dragons, funny enough, if you keep a female on her own, she will lay 10 eggs, for example. All 10 will hatch and they'll all be males, which is the complete opposite again. So she just produces males, and one of them, sometimes two of them, will have more testosterone than the others. And they'll be very aggressive. They'll kill their brothers, and they'll eventually mate with the mother. And as a result of that, how Komodos can move from one island to another. One single female can arrive there and she can repopulate the island. It's crazy how they work, but it's just survival of the fittest. And that's why reptiles have been around for such a long period of time, and how they can still adapt to what we've got. So, for example, with the crocodiles, what's happened now is some of the areas where they used to lay eggs, the eggs would incubate at, let's say, 30 degrees. Now with global warming, they're incubating at 32 degrees, which is then going to produce more of one gender instead of another, as well as people changing the area. They, for example, bringing in more sand instead of the normal soil and mud. So the sand then gets hotter. And as a result, that will also make, if the female has her eggs there, the eggs will incubate hotter. So as soon as humans start interfering with that, then it does become a problem. And then pollution obviously is causing problems, especially in areas where there's a lot of pollution. It causes problems for the crocodiles. The fat inside the tail eventually solidifies. They can't swim, and then they basically die because they can't swim and they can't feed.